Hello, Dolf de Roos here, and I've often explained to you the advantages of commercial real estate over residential real estate, and the fact that with residential property, the value of a piece of residential property is determined essentially by the market, both the capital value of the real estate itself and the rental value. And if you consider that the yield is the rent divided by the property purchase price of the value, then it's the market value of the rent divided by the market value of the property. That means the return is determined by the market. And that contrasts sharply with commercial real estate, where the formula for commercial real estate is simply that the value of a commercial building equals the rental income divided by the cap rate. Cap rate, of course, is short for capitalization rate. It literally means the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the value. If you think of cap rate in those terms, instead of the way that most people, even commercial agents, think of it, which is the return, it's selling at a cap rate of 5%, which is like it's selling at a return of 5%. It's not completely incorrect, but it leads to false thinking about real estate. So think of it in terms of cap rate is the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the value. So the formula is the value of commercial real estate is the rental income divided by the cap rate. Who determines the cap rate? Well, it's determined by the market. It varies from location to location. Cap rates on Wall Street in New York, a very desirable piece of land to have your real estate, and cap rates are as low as 2%, sometimes lower, 1.5%. Whereas in the backwaters of nowhere in some podunk town, cap rates might be 20 or 30%. All that means is that investors in such a lesser town will need a return of 20 or 30% before they're willing to invest. Whereas on Wall Street, they're willing to accept a mere 2% return because they know they'll always have a tenant and a very high quality tenant. So cap rates are determined by the market, they vary by geography, and they vary during economic cycles. So when the economy is very strong, cap rates tend to be low. And when the economy gets a bit more shaky, inflation's higher, cap rates tend to go up. But for any given market at any particular point in the economic cycle, the cap rate is determined by the market. So that leaves the rental income. Who determines the rental income? Well, you could say that the dollars per square foot that you can get for a certain category of tenants, such as office space or a coffee shop or something, that's determined by the market. And to a certain extent it is. But this is where the owner of commercial real estate or the potential purchaser of a piece of commercial real estate has some flexibility. And bear with me on this one, because if you understand this, there's almost no limit to what you can do with commercial real estate in terms of making money. And that is, imagine you have a thrift shop occupying 1,000 square feet of space on the ground floor of a commercial building, and they're paying $12 a foot. Maybe the market rentals for thrift stores is about $12 a foot. However, if you know that is an ideal location based on foot traffic and views of this premise from the road as you drive by, it's an ideal location for a coffee shop. And if the going rentals for a coffee shop, be it an independent or a Seattle's Best or Gloria Bean or Starbucks or whatever, if it's $24 a foot, then by switching out that tenant, obviously you can't do it halfway through a lease, but if their lease expires and the thrift shop chooses not to renew, or you tell them the rent's going to the new market rent of $24 a foot and they can't afford that, so they don't come back, or you just don't renew the lease, and you get this tenant in at $24 a foot, and then going from $12 to $24 a foot, you have essentially doubled the income. And by doubling the income, you've doubled the value of the building. So I've often explained this and talked about it, and that is why, to a large extent, the value of a commercial building to you, the investor, is in direct proportion to the quality of tenant you can attract. So what I want to talk about today is attracting quality tenants. How do you go about finding a tenant for your commercial premises? Because if you can figure out a way of attracting tenants the way other people perhaps can't, then you can create value where others haven't created value. And just to give this some perspective, I've done this in the past where, for instance, I came across a building. It was a vacant funeral parlor. No one wanted to own a funeral parlor. You all know what goes on inside a funeral parlor. It's not a very wholesome thought. They have viewing rooms and slumber rooms and chilling rooms, and no marks for guessing what they keep chilled in one of these funeral parlors. So it had been on the market for 3 years. The then owners couldn't find a tenant for it. The agents trying to sell it couldn't find a tenant for it. And it even went up for auction at one stage, but it got passed in because it failed to meet the reserve price. If you don't understand that terminology, then, you can look it up, Google it or something. It's not that difficult. When there is a minimum price that it has to sell for before the seller will let the sale go through, that's called a reserve price. Why a reserve price? I don't know, but just what it's called. So it failed to meet the reserve price. It got passed in at auction. So I didn't go about buying it, hoping that with all my techniques that I've got in my arsenal of things to do to get a tenant, that I'd be able to find a tenant. Because what if I bought the property vacant and then despite trying everything that I'm going to share with you today, despite that I still couldn't find a tenant, then I would be stuck with a building that I just paid a big lump of cash for without a tenant. Without a tenant, I can't afford to pay the mortgage. It's going to become tears all over. So I didn't want to buy a vacant building in the hope and expectation that I'd find a tenant. I thought about finding a tenant first. Now, just between you and I, is this legal to find a tenant before you buy the property? And I'm kind of shaking my head to get you to think along a certain way. But of course, there's nothing illegal about that. I'm not saying I own the building. In fact, what I did is I employed someone at the princely sum of the then going hourly rate of $8 an hour to phone every funeral director going further and further away from this town. And it took all of 2 days before she came across someone that said, yes, actually, I've always wanted to operate in that area. Most of the people she called said, no, how did you get my number? No, we're happy where we are. Or worse, don't ever call us again. Take me off your list. Is this a solicitation call or whatever? But one of them at the end of 2 days said, oh my gosh, yes, I've always wanted to operate there. And so she said, well, let me put you on to Dolf. And so I got on the phone with this guy. His name was Jeff. And I said, listen, full disclosure, I don't own this building. It's available for sale. Why would I tell my prospective tenant that this building is for sale? Well, I knew that in all probability, he wouldn't want to buy it, or he didn't have the capacity to buy it, or he didn't have the know-how or the inclination. Was there a chance that he said, wow, thanks for the tip-off, I'll buy it myself and don't ever call me again? There's a possibility. But in all the years that I've been doing this, where I've been calling prospective tenants without owning the building yet, and all the years I've done that, I've never had a single potential tenant buy the building from underneath me and leave me out in the cold. Because he said, as I expected him to say, he said, no, I don't want to own real estate. I don't know that game. I don't like that game. I know how to run funerals. I'm pretty good at that. So I need someone to own the building for me, and then I'll lease it from them and I can focus on what I'm good at. And I said, well, I just could be the right person for you because I'm interested in buying the building, but I don't want to run the business. So I said, go and have a look at it. And he did. And he called me back the next day. He said, it's perfect. I love it. I said, well, this is how it could work. If you sign an LOI, a letter of intent, or sometimes they're referred to as a heads of agreement, an HOA, if you sign a heads of agreement where subject to me buying the property, you will become the tenant, then I'm happy to have a crack at buying the property. And just to be really clear what this HOA means, this LOI, if I buy the building, he will be the tenant. But if for whatever reason I can't buy the building, I don't owe him anything. I don't owe him other premises. There's no commitment to look for that. And he was happy with that because as it stood, without me buying the building or having a crack at buying the building, he couldn't operate it anyway. He didn't want to buy it himself. He didn't know anyone else who could perhaps buy it for him. So I was in that sense a savior to him. Perhaps that's a strong word, but I was a key to him being able to operate in that area. So he looked at it and he said, great. I said, okay, let's sign this heads of agreement. And he said, whoa, Sonny Jim. He actually used the word Sonny Jim. He said, not so fast. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. Now, when you're a commercial landlord, that is music to your ears. Of course, you also want a long-term lease. I don't want to buy a building. And he said, well, I'll sign up for 6 months. In fact, can we make it 5? Because what happens if after 5 months, he decides he doesn't want to operate there anymore? He couldn't get business up and running well enough. That leaves me out in the cold. So if I'd been negotiating this, I would have been perfectly happy with a 5-year lease. However, one of the golden rules in my book, Real Estate Riches, one of the 8 golden rules is never be the first to name a figure. Because in general, the first person to name a figure always loses. So I said, okay, you want a long-term lease? How long do you want? Now remember, I would have been willing to accept 5 years. But he said, I'll do it if you give me a 10 plus 10-year lease. Now, 10 plus 10 means a 10-year lease. That's fixed. It's got a minimum period of 10 years with a right of renewal, an ROI, right of renewal for another 10 years. Now, in all full disclosure, the right of renewal is for the sole benefit of the tenant. it's not to the landlord's benefit. If at the end of the first 10 years, I'm thinking, well, he was a pretty good tenant, I think I want him to stay, I can't force him to stay because of that right of renewal. However, at the end of 10 years, if he likes it and if he wants to stay, then he has every right. He can renew his lease. It's a right of renewal. He has the sole and exclusive right to renew that lease. So it's of sole benefit to the tenant. And in that sense, I only had him on the hook for 10 years. But here's the funny thing. Banks, who play a big role in funding a lot of these commercial deals, they seem to really like it when there are rights of renewal in place because they see it as a 20-year lease. So anyway, I was happy with it. Remember, I would have been happy with 5, and the fact that I got a minimum of 10 was already double what I would have wanted, and perceptually, he kind of wanted a 20-year lease. So it's good all around. So I managed to get my tenant before I even had a crack at buying this building. So with that HOA, with that heads of agreement in place where he was willing to sign up for a 10 plus 10-year lease at a lease rate that was fixed, we worked out the dollars per square foot and how many dollars there were of how many square feet there were, but I guess effectively dollars, how many square feet there were of office space and how many square feet there was of things like extra long garaging, because the hearse is an extra long vehicle and you have to be able to take a coffin out of the back of the hearse while it's still all undercover so that nothing gets wet in case it's raining. So it had an extraordinarily long garage where you could get 4 or 5 cars in a row if it weren't a hearse. All these things, I had him on the hook for a lease like that before I went to negotiate. So I went back to the seller. And of course, I don't say to the seller, oh, lucky me, or through my efforts, I managed to find a tenant. So I've now got a tenant. The building's worth a lot more than it is to you. So let's now negotiate a cheap price for me. He's likely to think, well, if you've got a tenant, it is worth a lot more, as indeed it was to me. But what we did is I just went in there and said, well, I've been looking at this for a while. I think I'm willing to put in an offer, but it got passed in at auction. It failed to meet the reserve. Obviously, I'm not going to offer you even the reserve price because if that's what the market says it was worth, then the market would have paid that for it. So I got it for a cheap price, and I don't mind revealing what it was. It's many years ago now. Back then it was a lot of money, but it was $170,000. That was the contract price. So then I went to the bank, and you've got to understand that banks normally accept the lesser of the appraisal or the purchase price. So even if it appraised at $1 million with the tenant, it didn't, but just imagine, even if it appraised at $1 million, the fact that I was paying $170 for it is usually the figure that the bank uses to determine how much money they'll lend on it. And if they'll only lend 60% on the lesser of the purchase price of the appraised value, and I paid $170 for it, then you'd think that they'd be willing to lend $85,000 at 50%, and at 60%, I'd have to work it out. 7 6s are 42, and that's $102,000. However, what I did is I went to the bank and I said, Mr. Bank Manager, I fully admit that I'm only paying $170 for it. But Mr. Bank Manager, I bought it vacant. And since buying it vacant, I've secured a tenant. This is a well-known, respected industry leader who's been in the industry for decades, and he has signed a 10 plus 10-year lease on this building. The bank heard 20 years. And so I've got a long-term tenant paying good market rents on this. Surely you've got to agree it's worth more than $170,000. And even though they tend to be very stoic and they nod their head saying, no, not really, they deep down, they agree with you. So they gave it an appraisal. They went and did a valuation of $240,000. Was that fair? No, it wasn't. It was ridiculously and patently unfair. It was worth a lot more than that. Their own appraiser went back a year later. Nothing had changed. We were just 1 year into the 10-year lease. Nothing had changed. And they then appraised it at $300,000. That was closer to its true market value at that stage. Why were they reluctant to give it an appraisal of $300,000 when I initially went to get funding for it? I think it's because they weren't convinced that the tenant was for real, that he'd stick around. Because I guess it's technically possible that I find someone who pretends to be a funeral director and signs it for a lease, even though he's only got $10 to his name. I guess it's not that easy, actually, but I imagine this is what they're thinking. But after a year of the tenant paying rent every month, they had to somewhat reluctantly agree that this probably was a bona fide tenant. So they gave it a valuation after a year of $300,000. So their first appraisal at $240,000, I think, was ridiculously low and conservative, but that's how banks are. But never mind, they gave me somewhere around a 66% mortgage. It worked out at $160,000. So I got 160 from the bank. I paid 170 for it. That means obviously I only had $10,000 tied up in this property. That's not bad. That's as good as going in there without any cash. And then my rental from this tenant, I'm simplifying it because there was another building that used to be used as a place where they made coffins, but now they imported their coffins from overseas because it was cheaper. So this portion had been leased out to an engraving shop, people who engrave trophies and cups for sports events and that sort of thing. But when you add it all up, the rental that was collected was $30,000 a year. So $30,000 of rental income, $170,000 to purchase it. That's whatever it is, somewhere around 17% return. That's not bad. But my mortgage payment on this property, because remember, with commercial property, the tenants pay the outgoings, the property taxes, sometimes they're called rates in some parts of the world, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, all paid for by the tenant. So the rental I collected, in this case, it was $30,000. It was net to me. All I had to pay out of that was the mortgage. Now, interest rates were a lot higher back then. Now they've come down to 4%, 5%, 6%, depending on whether it's residential and commercial and your structure and everything. But back then it was really high, 16%, 18%. The highest I ever paid was 24%. And I paid it happily because I knew that in all probability, interest rates would come down. And when they did, affordability went up, so values went up. Anyway, to stick to the story, I only had to pay the mortgage, which was about $15,000 a year. So from my $30,000 income, after paying the mortgage, I was left with $15,000 cash. So how much cash did I put in versus how much cash did I pull out? Well, I put in $10,000 cash, right? The difference between the 170 and the 160. And I was pulling out $15,000 every year after everything had been taken into account. So 15,000 divided by 10,000 is 150%. So my question to you, as we get to the point of today's topic, is, was my return 17%, being the 30,000 of income divided by the 170,000 purchase price, or was my return 150%, 15,000 cash out of this deal on a $10,000 cash investment? And the truthful answer, the only correct answer, because I gave you two options, I hope you've figured it out in your own heads already, the only correct answer is that both are correct, because it depends how you define the return. If you talk about return as being rental income divided by purchase price, then it's 17%. In fact, we can go into ever finer gradations of refinement by saying, well, are we talking before tax or after tax? Because the 30,000 rental income is before tax. But if we're talking about after tax, don't just assume that we'll be paying tax on the 30,000. Remember, part of my 15,000 mortgage payment can be deducted from my income before I have to work out my tax. When I say part of it, back then, interest payments were tax deductible, but principal repayments were not. And it was a 30-year table mortgage, so every month a certain portion was interest deductible, a certain portion was principal repayment, not deductible. And then you can say, is the return that we're going to quote before we take depreciation into account or after depreciation? Because very often you might have net income, like in this case, it would have been 15,000 net income after paying the mortgage. But do I have to pay tax on 15,000? Well, not necessarily. If my depreciation deductions, we call it a phantom deduction because it doesn't actually cost you cash. But if my depreciation deductions were more than 15,000, let's say they were 20,000, then 20,000 from my 15,000 of net income means that on paper, I'm running at a loss. And in most jurisdictions, there are exceptions, but in many countries, in many parts of countries, because sometimes tax laws vary province by province or state by state, in many jurisdictions, you can deduct that paper loss against income in other entities. So that's pretty cool. So if I'm making a $15,000 cash profit after I pay all my expenses, including the mortgage, but I've actually got 20,000 of legitimate depreciation deductions, doesn't cost me that in cash, but I can take it off my income, and it drives my income negative. It means I can deduct that loss against other income. So it's as if the government is subsidizing my property. And I know some of you are saying, Dolf, don't get too ridiculous. Why on earth would governments subsidize real estate? Well, they do, and there's a specific reason for that, and I'm happy to go into it. I go on all these tangents, but that's because I don't have a script. But it's the tangents in life that make life interesting. There are two reasons why governments levy taxes on you. One is simply to generate revenue. They provide services like border control, where visitors coming and need to show their passport, and they run it by a database of known unwanted people and all that sort of thing. That's an idea. They provide services on a more local level, fire brigade services and policing services. So that's why they need to levy tax in order to pay for all the services that governments provide. But there's another reason that most people don't think of as to why governments charge tax and how they determine which tax to charge, and that is to shape social policy. And the easiest example I can give here is that there's an extraordinarily high tax, a disproportionately high tax on cigarettes and alcohol. Why? Because they think those suckers are going to, suckers, well, I didn't intend that to be a pun, but is it because those people can afford it, or no, it's they want to discourage smoking. They know that people who smoke cost the government enormous amounts of money, disproportionate amounts of money in terms of healthcare, especially as people go through life. The cumulative deleterious effects of smoking get more and more severe. So eventually the government spends a lot of money looking after people who've succumbed to whatever disease comes from smoking. So they discourage it by having a high excise tax, it's sometimes called. Same on alcohol, it's to discourage overly large consumption. And similarly, when it comes to real estate, they often charge taxes or decide on tax rates to shape our behavior. And the government knows it's not a particularly good provider of accommodation for the needy, so it gives us incentives to do their work for them. So it gives us an incentive and says, if you provide accommodation for the needy, then we'll give you a tax incentive. In fact, you can claim depreciation. We're going to allow you to claim depreciation as if real estate goes down in value. Now, you've got to ask yourself, sometimes, I know politicians do some pretty silly things, but do you think that that's silly as to think that real estate really goes down in value and that they're fairly allowing you to compensate that property as if it's got a useful lifespan of 28 and a half years on the basis that at the end of 28 and a half years, that property is worth zero? No, they're not that silly. They know, just like all of us do, that over time, real estate tends to go up in value. In 1947, the value of an average house was $2,400, and by 1956 or something, it was $8,000. It just keeps on going up. Why do they allow you to depreciate it on the basis that it's going down, when in actual fact, we all know that with very few exceptions, it goes up? And the reason is it's to encourage you to do something they're not very good at. And so there it is. You can claim depreciation. So with depreciation added into the equation, your returns are even better. In fact, I was getting 150% return based on my net cash out relative to my net cash in. But that's before we take depreciation into account. If we take depreciation into account in addition, my returns are better. In fact, I might get a subsidy from the government because on paper I'm running at a loss. So instead of getting 150% return, I might get 180% return or 210% return. So these are all things that you can do with commercial property that you can't do with residential property. Remember, as we said way at the beginning, with residential property, the rental you collect is determined by the market, and the purchase price of the property is determined by the market, and therefore the return is determined by the market. Right now in Phoenix, where I am, average returns are hovering somewhere, depending on the suburb, of course, between 4.8 and 5.3%. That's determined by the market. You might get a slight anomaly, someone who's selling their house fast and therefore cheaply, but right now in this hot market, that's not happening very often. Whereas when it comes to commercial real estate, if you can find a good tenant or a better tenant, or if you can find a tenant for a vacant building, then you can increase the value like a step function, meaning, it might be worth $200,000 to buy vacant, but with your access to a tenant, it's worth $300,000 or $350,000 or whatever the numbers are. So what becomes really crucial is how do we find a tenant for one of these spaces? And this is where I gave you one example already. One is to pay someone to phone around. And by the way, $8 an hour, I told you that is what I paid this person to phone around. It took them 2 8-hour days. 2 lots of 8 is 16 hours total, times 8 is 18, 6, 8, so 48, it's $128. It cost me $128 to have this person man the phones for 2 days. And by the way, to make the deal even sweeter, that $128 was tax deductible because that expense was incurred in trying to generate taxable income. And then at the end of that exercise, we had a tenant willing to pay essentially $30,000 a year for 10 years. with a right of renewal for another 10 years. And can you see how lucrative this can be? So that is one way of finding a tenant. But let's now, in the remaining time we've got on this podcast, let's talk about some of the other mechanisms of attracting a tenant. And, I should really prompt you to come up with some. One of the biggest things you can do, I think, is to get a big banner made. So a canvas banner. Why canvas? It tends to last long. It's better than painting a piece of cotton like an old sheet. And you might hang it there. It might look good for a day. It looks tatty on day 2. And by day 3, the wind's torn it and all that sort of thing. So spend a bit of money. It won't cost you that much, a couple of $100, and have a big banner made with for lease or for rent, whatever is typical in your area. For lease is more common in commercial space. And then be absolutely certain to put a phone number and a website on there. Some people like phoning and talking on the phone. Other people have an abhorrence for phone calls and they want to go to a website. If you don't have a website for this property, don't say to me, Dolf, I couldn't put a website on there because I don't have a website. If you don't have a website, it's probably because you're an old fuddy-duddy and you don't know how to do it. So hire a 12-year-old. Yes, 12-year-olds are doing it at school. It is so simple now. Get a website. Okay, 15-year-old maybe. Get a website with a URL, put it there. Don't make it the address of the property. That might sound like, well, it's kind of a clever move, isn't it? No, it's not. Because if you use a website that you can recycle and use for other properties, then when you've got a different property for rent or for lease, you can put that same website, in fact, keep the same banner, hang it on the new building, and then direct them to the same website, and it won't be limited to that address. It won't confuse anyone. So just make up a website. It's pretty easy to do. And then put all the details on the website. And by all the details, don't succumb to this strange thinking where you have to withhold something like, I can't tell them how many square feet it is, and I can't tell them how many dollars per square foot, or dollars per square meter, or the total rent per month. I can't do that because if I get them to call me, then I can talk with them and I can engage them and I'll talk them into it. Life doesn't work with that. For every person that might still call you when there's not enough information for them to know what it's all about, and you talk them into it, for every one of those, there are probably 5 who look at your website and say, they don't even want to put what the rent is. What are they being secretive about? So just get out there and do it. So anyway, that's what I would recommend. Have a website there with all the information there and see what comes from that. Then another thing I do is print flyers, like A4 if you're in the metric world, or just a letter-sized sheet of paper, and include some photos. Put color photos in there. Have one of the outside, have some of the inside, have the address, have how many square feet or square meters it is. Put the dollars per square foot and the total amount you want to collect and rent, whether it's triple net or gross modified lease. If you don't know what that is, figure it out before you put them in, because you don't want to commit yourself to something that you don't understand. But have all the information there. And then either employ someone to deliver them 6 cents a sheet, or I don't know, whatever, $50 for a ream to go around all the businesses, or do it yourself. You'll be surprised what you come across if you spend half a day going to all the businesses within a mile of your location. Of course, it depends on the density as to whether that's practical and reasonable to do. In New York, it probably wouldn't be reasonable within a mile, but in New York, you wouldn't need to go for a mile. You just do it for a couple of 100 yards. But I think you get the idea and talk with people and say, listen, I've got this coffee shop or this warehouse or this office space or whatever. And before I go to the open market, I just want to let you all know that it's going to come on the market soon. And more often than not, people will say, you're really weird, or get out of here, or you're in our pizza parlor. Do you want to buy a pizza or not? Whatever, go with it. It doesn't matter, because you'll be surprised how often you go, oh my gosh, my cousin's moving here and he's looking for space. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Listen, and do you have anyone else? Can you take it off the market for a day? I'm going to call him right now. In fact, he's at work. I'll call him out. You get the drift. You'll get someone. Will it work every time? No, but it's a numbers game. Folks, I'm going to give you 10, 20, 30 different things you can do. And one of them will work on this building, and another one will work on the next building. Another one will work on a third building, and you miss out on that one, but it didn't matter. You didn't have it under contract anyway. And then you'll find another one, and yet another idea will work for that. Life is a numbers game. And we always say, if you catch fire with enthusiasm, people will come from miles around to watch you burn. It's worth being enthusiastic. And I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. If you're dull, boring, and disinterested, you'll have a tougher job getting a tenant. All right, so we're rapidly running out of time here, but you know what? There are so many things you can do. Go and see some commercial leasing agents And commercial selling agents too, because they often hear from potential tenants. They'll get a call from somebody who says, listen, I don't have the money to buy a building, but I'm looking for space. Do you have anything on your books? They'll remember it. Let it be known. Advertise on all the local services. I mean, try and rent it yourself first and save the commission. But if it's been a month and you want to get a tenant, put it on LoopNet, put it on Trixie, put it on the local commercial real estate agent site. Go to commercial leasing agents, see what they'll do to take it on for you. Go and see all the neighbors. Just sing it from the rooftops, basically, not literally, but let it be known. And you'll be surprised how quickly and easily you may get a tenant. And if you can't get a tenant, despite being this enthusiastic bundle of energy, then maybe it's not a building you want to own. Because if despite all that effort, you still can't get a tenant, then do you really want to own that building? Because I like owning buildings in places where there's demand. And one great indicator of demand is that it's relatively easy to get a tenant, especially when you beat the competition to the punch by having all manner of different systems. You've got your flyers, you're knocking on doors, you've got your big banner on there, you've gone online and posted things online. If you've done all of that, chances are you will get a tenant. All right, we have run out of time. That gives you some ideas on how you can get a tenant. And I wish you all the good luck out there. And in the meantime, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing.